We have to be careful how we judge and how we express our judgment to others. Paul told the church at Ephesus in Ephesians 4, he says, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as good for building up as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." Somebody comes to me and they're in a sin. And I have choices that I can make. I could tell them, "Well, you're an idiot. You're a fool. What are you doing? You're going to destroy your life." Or I can say, "Listen, what does the Bible say? You got your reasons for what you're doing, but let me tell you what God says. And no matter what decision you make, I'm still going to love you. But understand, I don't think that's a great idea. Would that be best for you right now? You really think that would be a good idea? You may want to rethink that." As humans, we have I'm going to call it a gift. I'm not going to call it a spiritual gift. We have the gift of judgment. We have a tendency, it's a common human behavior, to have opinions about something and to judge others based upon our opinions. And unfortunately, it's extremely prevalent in the church. Judging is deeply ingrained into our very nature. But because we are to pass judgment on some things, obviously, but despite the fact that we are quick to judge, we don't like being judged. We may be quick to give our opinion, but we don't always want to ask everybody else their opinion. And judging is not necessarily a bad thing because it's part of our natural being, because we need to judge things every day. I mean, try driving down the road and not being able to judge. How far is that car and how fast are they going? Should I pull out right now? Should I go left or should I go right? Especially with all this construction going on. It's hard to get from point A to point B without having to take a detour and do, I've lived here long enough now. I know like 50 different ways of getting someplace. So do I go down one of the side streets so I can get around the light? How busy is it right now? I mean, we're constantly passing judgment and judging things. It's something we need to do. When we're tempted, we need to be able to know what's right, what's wrong. That's part of judgment. So it's a good thing that God has given us, but the problem is any good thing that God gives us can be used in a bad way. And it's not that we're being mean or we're being vicious. It's not that we're looking to judge someone to hurt them. And we might even think that we're being kind in what we say to people. But the truth is that many times it's better for us to keep ourselves quiet. Keep our judgments to ourselves in certain situations. Did you know that for each negative statement that we hear, it takes 5 positive statements to overcome it? Now, think about that when raising your children. I'm guilty of it. One of my children does something I don't like, and I've told him about it before. I get frustrated and I say something, and before it's even completely made it out of my mouth and it's to their ears, I realize, I probably shouldn't have said it like that. So it's going to take 5 statements of affirmation to overcome that one negative statement. So today we're looking at a passage that addresses our tendency to pass judgment. Paul's going to provide some powerful reminders of who the true judge is and how we should view ourselves and how we should view others in light of the grace of God. So let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, starting with verse 1. Here's what Paul says. This is how one should regard us. He's talking about us. When he says us, he means how they should regard the apostles. Because remember, the church had been saying, well, I follow Paul, I follow Cephas, I follow Apollos. They were looking at the apostles and they were comparing them to each other, trying to determine who was the greatest, at that moment, and say, well, I follow them. He says, this is how I want you to regard us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. He's saying you should look at us not as these great teachers who you learn so much from, and you make your identity out of them, which is the same thing that happens today. We have churches that have what are called celebrity pastors. Well, what church do you go to? Well, I go to this church. Oh, yeah, I've heard about that pastor. Yeah, I've seen him on TV, or I've seen him on YouTube, or whatever. And we feel good because we're part of something like that. See, the church had put the pastors on a pedestal, the leaders, the apostles. But Paul says, no, we're servants. We're servants of Christ, and we're the keepers of the mysteries, the stewards of the mysteries of God. There's things that God has told us that we need to teach you. Being a servant of Christ is foundational to the aspect of the Christian life. We all are to be servants of Christ. And a servant of Christ is someone who, number one, is humble. They're not looking out for themselves. They're looking out for what Christ wants. They're obedient to Christ, and they're committed to serving others just as Christ did. So look what Paul wrote about Jesus to the church at Philippi. In Philippians chapter 2, he says, he's talking about Christ, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. God, Jesus, was sitting with God the Father in the throne room. He gave that up for time being to come down here and to be found as a human like us. He humbled himself. He chose that life. He chose to come down. He wasn't forced. He did it because the Father had a plan. And Jesus is like, I'll do it. His life was marked by acts of service. Look at every time he goes, he's walking along the road from one place to another. He sees a blind person. He sees a lame person. What does he do? He heals him. He's on the mountainside and he's teaching. He's been teaching for a long time. And there's thousands of people there, men, women, children. And they have no place to get food. So what does he do? He gathers what they had and he breaks it, and it becomes more and more. And he feeds the 5,000. His life was a life of service, culminating in that moment in the upper room where they come in, and usually the first thing you do if you're sat at the table, we tell our kids, wash your hands. Well, they'd have to wash their feet because they wore sandals and they were walking on dirty roads. And it was always the servant who did that. The lowest of the low would do it. And here Jesus gets down and begins washing his disciples' feet, serving them. That's the kind of attitude we need to have if we're going to be servants of Christ. As the servant of Christ, our primary responsibility is to be faithful to God, not seeking human approval. In fact, many churches today have forgotten. I'm not here to have the world approve what I say and what I do. I may be cautious what I say if I don't want it to be pulled offline, but I'm still going to proclaim the gospel. And I've decided that if I am going to proclaim something that's controversial that the world doesn't like, I'm still going to do it. I may, blank out the words or blank out the audio at that point so that the algorithm, the computer doesn't hear it, but the message is still going to be there. And I have other platforms that I don't have to do that on, so I'll send people there. We can't worry about what the world thinks. Our goal is not to get human approval. Look at the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. Each servant was given a certain amount of resources to manage while the master was away. And when he comes back, they have to give an account. But see, when he comes back, it's not about the amount that they were given. It was how faithful they were with that amount. See, in our lives, if we are managing a business, leading a family, or if we're serving in ministry or going to school, our role is to be faithful stewards, not to seek the glory for ourselves. Now, Paul's going to continue on here. He's going to talk about the problem with human judgment. He says here in verse 3 of chapter 4, he says, "But with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself." Which is interesting because don't we many times judge ourselves more harshly than even anybody else would? Paul says, I don't even judge myself. "For I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God. From God. The human judgment is many times based upon incomplete information. We pass judgment on something that somebody is doing because we don't know the whole story, or we're biased towards it. Now, understand, there are some things we'll talk about, some things we are to judge, but Paul's not dismissing the value of accountability or the value of seeking the opinion of others. He's not saying, do whatever you want, don't worry about what anybody else says, just do it. What he is saying is that be careful how you judge. Look at the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs says, in Proverbs 11:14 says, "Where there is no guidance, a people falls. But in an abundance of counselors, there is safety." See, God tells us we need to have people around us who can share with us their good opinions. We have to have people who we can trust in because we need people around us. But we got to be careful that we're not judging incorrectly. We must understand that human opinions should not be our ultimate measure of our worth or of our faithfulness. See, I think that's what happens a lot of times. We go to a friend of ours, and that we ask that friend their opinion on something, and they tell us something. While it may be true, it hurts. And then we begin to look at ourselves. It taints what we think about ourselves. That person, that was their opinion. Does it hold some worth? Sure, but it doesn't determine who I am. And it doesn't determine my faithfulness and my worthiness